Hello, everybody. I am Joe Harper, and this is Reformed Truther Ministries. In today's video, this is going to be interacting with Falling Flat Part 6. So, as I've been going through this series, we have been going through this book, Falling Flat, a Refutation of Flat Earth Claims by Dr. Danny Faulkner. And we have really been going through how we've been trying to demonstrate, we've been trying to show how Faulkner oftentimes will use straw man arguments to misrepresent flat earths. We've talked about how we have demonstrated how sometimes he's misrepresented the history, or some of the arguments related to biblical arguments have not been helpful. They've been actually quite unhelpful. And we've basically tried to just summarize what we've been doing with this series is we've been showing that Faulkner is not this reliable source of information on this topic the way that he is portrayed to be by many prominent evangelical ministries, churches, pastors. There are many people who are saying this book is the book that should be used, and we've been trying to demonstrate that it is not. And last week we finished up the biblical arguments, and we really proceeded into empirical arguments, and I tried to show there was scientific evidence to support what the Bible says, that the earth does not move. And we were talking about how we should just take what the scriptures say at face value, and we can even say there are good scientific arguments to back that up. Now, as we come to this video today, the Lord is starting to lead me in some other directions. So this is going to be the last video in this series. I've decided, I've given this a lot of thought, but there's some other things that I feel that I need to get to next. So I'm not going to get as far into the into all of the empirical arguments that maybe I could have before, but these are things that we've talked about on this channel. If you want to go deeper into empirical arguments for flat Earth, I have an interview with my friend Michelle Sandovich where we did an empirical case for flat Earth, and Brian Dean, we also did an interview with him, and we also talked about this when we did the flat Earth panel. And Brian did a really good job of talking about how, you think of how you're looking for lack of curvature, because really the biggest argument is that once you see the truth of flat Earth, you can literally look at the landscapes and you realize that you see things that should be obscured by the curvature of the earth. People have even been able to see Chicago from the other side of Lake Michigan, or people on high peaks of elevation are able to see very far, or people riding up in airplanes looking through the window, you can see the vast distances. All of these things that should be affected by the curvature of a globe Earth, you realize that that is the case. And when we did our interview with Brian, he talked about how we often think of it in terms of looking how far we can see one direction, but he also used the argument of the wingspan argument, which was a really good argument and something that was presented differently than I had heard from anybody else. He said, well, you think of how far you can look this way, and then you take your vision, you go 180 degrees, how far you can look the other way, and you start to think of the lack of curvature in light of that. That is really a powerful argument that he brought forth. So these are things we have talked about before. I was going to go through some of the same material again, and we're going to cover a bit more material today. But I feel like even at this point, even though we're not going to cover every single issue related to cosmology, because there's so much more we could cover. We could talk about eclipses. We could talk about all sorts of phenomenon with the stars in the sky. Like I already said, lack of curvature. There's so many things we could get into. Satellites. There's all sorts of. I mean, there's channels that are just dedicated to these type of videos over and over and over again. But I think the main point, and we've shown this especially with the historical and the biblical arguments, and those are really the areas that are more my forte anyway. I think we've already demonstrated that this book is not the gold standard that it is portrayed to be. And so even if we don't get into as exhaustive into the biblical arguments, that's still okay. I am planning to put there is a video I found that's helpful talking about how we can see things that are so far away that we shouldn't be able to see them. I'm going to include that in the links below for this channel. So if somebody wants to get into that, they'll have a video that they can go watch and get into that more. And then, like I said, there's other material on my channel. And I was going to say before we get into the material for this video today, if you have questions about that or you want to interact that more, someone who's respectful, even if you disagree, if you want to send me an email, I am more than willing to interact with that. But all that being said, by way of introduction, really, that being said, that's really the main empirical argument that the proof for the flat earth really is right in front of your eyes once you have the blinders come off and you can see the truth for what it is, that we're able to see things that we simply shouldn't be able to see. That really is the argument in a nutshell. And I know that will not convince the skeptics, it won't convince people with their biases, but that is the truth. And the truth is there for us to see if we want to see it. But really, what I want to focus on for the rest of our time today to finish up this series is I want to talk about the history of NASA. And the reason why I want to do this is because when you get into this argument of cosmology, one of the biggest issues that come up and one of the biggest hangups that people have is when you're saying space as it has been presented to us by the news, the media, through Hollywood, through the education system, through all of these different means of indoctrination, we've been taught this view of space and the cosmos and the galaxies and the stars and the planets and all the rest of it. And we've talked about how the heavenly bodies are actually under the firmament and they're much, much closer to us than what we have been taught to believe. And so basically the argument in a nutshell is that yes, as flat earthers, we do not believe that space, the way it's been presented to us, is reality. And yes, space is fake. there I said it. And that's really the biggest hangup. And people will get so hung up on this because we've been taught that NASA, which puts out all these images and these videos of people being suspended in gravity. We can think of what we've been taught about the Apollo missions, the moon landing, the International Space Station, satellites, all of this stuff. And even though there is good evidence to show that there's so many discrepancies in the videos and the photos they put out, so many people get so hung up on this because we've been taught for so long to believe that NASA is this credible, trustworthy government institution. And even many Christians who have extreme skepticism regarding the government with things which handled with COVID, or they see the government overreach, they see the tyranny in other areas, and they can be very consistent in being distrustful in regards to those things, really have a huge hang-up when it comes to space and NASA. And that's true, I mean, in the baby boomer generation, they're the ones who saw the supposed moon landing on TV. They're the ones who really had this pushed into them. It's really connected to this idea of patriotism and American exceptionalism. And so it's very, very hard to get through that. And this has been presented to us in movies. I can think of movies, say, like Apollo 13, which I remember watching. I was like, oh, wow, that was a really good, inspiring movie. You got Tom Hanks, you got these other actors in this movie, and they're talking about how they saved these guys from death in space after their failed mission. And it gets you really fired up. You got the epic soundtrack, and you're like, oh, NASA, America, what a great thing. And those are the type of emotional connections that are hard to get away from. So all that being said, what I want to do today is to help. I know I can't completely help people break through some of that programming, but what I can do is present a coherent case for that NASA is really an organization that is steeped in occultism. As we're going to go through the history, we're really going to start at World War II, and we're going to work our way up to the moon landing today. We're going to see that there is an exorbitant amount of occult influence on the history of NASA. And will that convince all of the skeptics of all of the issues I laid out previously? No. But what it should show for Christians who have discernment is it should give us pause and say, if there is this much amount of occult influence with what we know about demons and spiritual warfare and the devil and the occult, all the things the Bible teaches on that subject, should that give us suspicion regarding NASA? Should that lead us to have a conclusion of, hey, if there's this much occultism steeped in this organization, should that also lead us to believe that there could be a lot of deception coming out of this organization? The answer to that is yes. Because you can't compartmentalize and say, well, their worldview is so occultic for many of these prominent individuals we're going to talk about, including the founder of NASA, Wernher von Braun. We're going to talk about certain directors of mission control, certain astronauts who are Masons. You can say, well, that's so noteworthy and that's documented. But then we're going to, as Christians, we're going to compartmentalize and say that everything that's coming out of these people's mouth is trustworthy, what have you. And that's the argument that Dr. Danny Faulkner is making. And we're going to see that. I'm going to read a couple excerpts from his book before I get into my history of NASA. And he's saying, well, people would say, well, does your doctor need to be a Christian to perform heart surgery on you? And I would say, no, he doesn't. But I would also say this. If I had somebody said to me, Joe, you got to go into surgery in however many weeks or months, and they would say, they present two doctors to me who, according to the reports I'm given, are basically, in terms of their trustworthiness, their record of going through surgery, their proficiency, their skill, they're basically the equivalent. One's a trustworthy Christian, and the other would be some type of, let's just say, an occultist, because that's kind of what we're talking about here. Well, I'm gonna, of course, as a Christian, I'm gonna choose the Christian one every single time, because yeah, I mean, just because someone's not a Christian doesn't mean they couldn't do that skill, but I still believe that worldview, your faith, morals that come from true morality only comes from the work of the Spirit in the heart. Those things matter, and I'm going to be inclined to feel a lot more safe, a lot more trustworthy with the Christian than with the non-Christian. And let me give another example in terms of why this history being steeped in occultism is relevant for us. It's because of the fact that, let's say that there's a restaurant that I frequent, and I've been in there enough times, I like the food. I start to realize that, hey, the people that are running this place, whether it's the owners or the cooks or the people waiting on the tables, that they were all a bunch of Satanists or occultists. Now, does that necessarily mean that there's something shady about how they're cooking the food or whatever? Well, not necessarily, but I know that if I discovered that, I'm immediately, as a Christian, going to have a different flavor for how I feel about going to that place. If I learn that, I'm not going to be as comfortable there. I'm going to say, wow, that's really weird. That's strange. It's going to feel off. It's going to, like, my spidey sense is going to be tingling, if I want to use that illustration. And that's the way it is. And that would be true of any institution, type of business, place you're going to. You're immediately going to be more skeptical, and you're going to be more suspicious, and you're going to be less comfortable and safe in that type of a place, because worldview does matter, and that's what I'm trying to say. And and some people will present the arguments. They'll say, well, there are Christians who have claimed to have gone into space, and you don't take them at their word. And I go, well, no, not if I look at what the Bible says very clearly, number one, and then I look at all of this historical evidence and this empirical evidence that we've been going through in this series, and I've gone through in other videos, and then I also take, they're a part of this just because someone claims to be a Christian and they're part of this institution that is steeped in all this bad history, just because they make that claim doesn't necessarily mean that I'm just going to take it at face value. And that's what the type of things evangelical Christians will do in regards to claims regarding space. But it's inconsistent, because they are much more skeptical, or much more discerning to evaluate claims in other areas of life. So if someone's a Christian and they claim to be able to have a prophetic insight, or things in the charismatic movement, these healings, whatever, a lot of the more discerning Christians, they're much more, just because someone claims to be a Christian and they make those claims doesn't necessarily mean that they're just going to accept that at face value. There's going to be a process of discernment. There's going to be a process of saying, well, is there any credibility to this, or is this just one of these charismatics that's in hyper, heretical circles, the Benny Hinn circles? So it's funny how we can be so much more critical, discerning, cautious in regards to claims made by professing Christians in other areas. But then when it comes to these space claims, just take it at complete face value. So I think you guys get where I'm going with this. What I'm trying to say in a nutshell is worldview does matter. The history of the institution does matter. And when we get into this history of NASA today, we're going to see that that matters. Now, all that being said, before I get into this, I want to read a verse from Scripture, Psalm 19:1. And I want to read this for two reasons. One, because I think this psalm reflects the truth of the heavens, the firmament that we've talked about, how the heavenly bodies are in this solid dome covering called the firmament. That's what Scripture teaches. We've gotten into all of that. And the other thing that we've gotten into, or not that we've gotten into yet, but the other reason why I want to read this verse is because this is the verse that's actually on Wernher von Braun's tombstone. And people have speculated, did he know the truth, and did he put it on there for that exact reason? Some people could say that that's conspiracy theorists making connections that aren't there. But it's very, very interesting that he put Psalm 19:1. That's what is on his gravestone. It's very interesting. You can look this up. But let me read this verse. It says, Psalm 19:1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork." And that verse becomes even more powerful and prescient when you understand all of the truth regarding creation that Scripture teaches that we've gone through in the past two videos. So that's really where I want to start today. And that being said, we're going to start, for the rest of this video, we're going to go through the history of NASA. And we're going to start with Wernher von Braun. We're going to start in World War II because the American rocket program is actually rooted in the Nazi rocket program. So we're going to start in the 1940s, really 1943 to 1945, in that era, really in the middle of World War II. And we're going to go up to the moon landing. And I know there's more we could cover post-moon landing, but basically I want to show everybody really the origins of where NASA came from, and I want to get into this story. So we're going to get into a lot of history here. And what we need to understand about Wernher von Braun is that he is really the father of NASA, the founder of NASA. He was really the main leader in getting the American rocket program going and getting NASA going. This is indisputable history. But what we need to understand is that before he came to the States and before he had that history of really getting NASA going, that Wernher von Braun was a major in the SS, and that he was working as a scientist for the German rocket program, and they had a very extensive rocket program, and that he was working at the Peenemünde Army Research Center, that the Peenemünde base, and he was, at that time, this is when the Nazis were developing they developed the V-1 rocket, which is really the predecessor to our first cruise missiles. And then they developed the V-2 rocket, which was really the predecessor to our intercontinental ballistic missiles. And what we need to understand, and then they were using extensive slave labor at this base. So there's a dark history regarding the origins, the Nazi origins of rocketry. And I think rocketry in of itself, the ability to shoot something up into the air, in a rocket, that's technology is relatively neutral in of itself. It's what you're using it for that makes it good or bad. But really, the origins of it comes from a dark place. And what we need to understand, because he was a major in the SS, so relatively high up in the officer corps of the SS, what we need to understand is that if you were in the SS during World War II, you were not a fringe Nazi, because as the war ended, a lot of Nazis wanted to separate themselves or downplay their connections to Nazism. And some of the people in the rank and file Wehrmacht were able to do this. But if you were a member of the SS, it was indisputable that you were a true believer. You were a true believer in the ideology of Nazism, because you had to be to get in there and really to become a member of the SS, and especially to move up in the leadership of the SS. You had to be able to prove your German ancestry back to a certain point, even as far back as the 17 or 1800s. They would have to prove their Aryan ancestry. And you also, when you went through the training to become part of the SS, and then the fighting SS, the Waffen SS, those were the units that were some of the elite units in the German military. But you had to go through extensive, not only physical training to be a part of the SS, but they went through extensive ideological training, which would essentially be brainwashing. And so these guys were fanatical. They were the real deal. They really believed in the beliefs of Nazism. They really believed in the beliefs of Aryanism, the German Superman. And that we really need to understand is that the Nazi Party as a whole and the movement that Hitler started, it's really steeped in occultism. I can't get into all of the details regarding Hitler and all of the leadership of the Nazi Party, even though that would be an interesting study. If you look up some of the secret societies that had an influence on Nazism, you could look up societies such as the Tula Society, Thule in the English, the Tula Society, or the Vril Society, and that Hitler, he had a lot of connections to people who had connections to the occult. And this is something that is really well documented. And the same is true for the SS, which once again were the elite. They were really the front runners of promoting the belief of Nazism. They were the ones that were helping to usher in the 1,000-year Reich. And that Himmler, who was the head of the SS, that he was a big believer in the occult. and that the SS as a whole, it was really an occult organization, and you could even go as far to call it a cult in its own right. And just a little bit of history on Himmler, because this is relevant for us in regards to our study in NASA, because we're going to see a lot of these people who are members of the SS, who are members of this occult organization, were brought over to the United States and really founded the American rocket program. So this history on the SS is relevant for us for understanding NASA. But Himmler, who once again was the head of the SS, he really, when you look at his early life, he was raised in Munich, devout Roman Catholic family. Munich in Bavaria, that has historically been a very extensively Roman Catholic area in Germany, and it's an area where the Jesuits historically have had a lot of influence, even going back to the Jesuits' influence in that area, Bavaria, the University of Ingolstadt. That's really the same part of the world where the Illuminati under Adam Weishaupt was founded, who he himself was a professor of canon law at the University of Ingolstadt. He had connections to the Jesuits, and really starting with Himmler. Himmler did have connections to the Jesuits in his own right, and that he had his uncle, who was also his godfather, was even a Jesuit priest, and this has been historically documented. And what we really need to understand is that Himmler himself was obsessed with the occult and matters related to the occult. He really was obsessed with the ideas connected to Norse mythology. He was obsessed with the ideas of the pre-Christian Aryan roots, Germanic history. These were things that he was really interested in, and these ideas of recovering the Aryan superman. That goes back to these ideas that he believed that the German people had lost something by moving away from their pagan occult roots into Christianity, and they really believed that if they went back to some of those things, that would really help them to recover being the Superman and the Aryan Superman, and recovering the Thousand-Year Reich, this is all creepy stuff. And you would say, well, how does his connections to the Jesuits tie into that? Aren't the Jesuits these supposedly Catholic Christian priests? And if you understand the history of Jesuitism, which I've talked a lot about previously on my channel, you'll understand that the Jesuitism has always been a big promoter of promoting syncretism. Wherever they go, when they've sent missionaries across the world historically, places like India, Francis Xavier went to India, to various parts of the Americas, they would always tell the people, keep your existing beliefs, keep your pagan, anti-Christian beliefs, just add Catholicism right on top of it. So Himmler, even in a lot of his speeches, you would say paradoxically or contradictory, that he often will talk about how damaging Christianity was. He would say, but he has connections to the Jesuits. But when you understand the duality and the mixed messages and the syncretism that has been promoted by Jesuits throughout history, it's actually not as contradictory. Well, I mean, it is contradictory and paradoxical, but it actually makes a lot more sense when you understand that history. But really, Himmler's vision, and we need to understand this to understand how this ties into NASA, is that Himmler saw the SS as the Arthurian knights that were going to be the protectors and the guardians of the Thousand-Year Reich. He really believed in a lot of this stuff. He was obsessed with runes. He was obsessed with this mythology. He really got into all of this stuff. And the headquarters that he chose for the SS, what was called Wewelsburg Castle, which was in the Teutoburg Forest, which has a lot of history connected to Germany. It was really this creepy castle that he chose to be the headquarters of his SS. And he even had a crypt there where they were going to have fallen SS heroes would be entombed there in this crypt under the castle. And there's so many things that I could talk about to demonstrate this occult history. He had a spiritual advisor called Karl Maria Willigut, and this guy was his spiritual advisor, and he claimed to have clairvoyant visions or memories of the ancient pre-Germanic past. And Himmler bought into this. He thought that this guy really could see back to how things were back then, and this was feeding into his ideology. And the other thing I want to mention is there was an SS research division called the N.A.S.A, and they would send teams of expeditions across the world. They'd go to places like Tibet, wherever, where they would look for either proof of German racial superiority, or they would look for proof uh, for things of occult significance, artifacts. So this was really a lot of this history of the SS that I'm mentioning is a really the inspiration for some of the stuff you even see in the Indiana Jones films, where Indiana Jones is going after these artifacts, and these teams, these expeditions of Nazis are going up against him, competing with him, trying to stop him and take those artifacts for themselves. A lot of that stuff that ended up in Hollywood is based in this history that has been somewhat put under the lid. When you go through histories of World War II, you don't always get some of these details regarding Nazism presented in the mainstream, and it's relevant for us. But moving forward, that kind of lays the groundwork. This is the organization, the SS, that Werner von Braun was a part of, and he was, like I said, a major, an officer. He was relatively high up. So it gives you some idea of what he was involved in. But as the war was coming to a close in 1945, the Americans, and primarily the OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA, they decided that they wanted to take Nazis that were going to be helpful for them and smuggle them out of Europe, even some of them that were war criminals. And they did this with Nazi scientists and brought them over to the United States to work on, to bring all that technology over to the US so we could use it in the fight against the communists, against the Russians. And also, they also did this, even though I won't get into all this, they did this with a lot of the German intelligence officers, a lot of people that were a part of the German intelligence apparatus. They wanted to use those guys once again in the emerging Cold War conflict. So the operation that was used for the scientists is called Operation Paperclip, but the adjoining operation for the intelligence guys was called Operation Sunrise. You can look all this up. And there's a lot with World War II when you get into who funded the communists and the Bolshevik Revolution and who funded Hitler in the 20s and 30s. It actually does go back to a lot of the same people at the top. So World War II is a complicated history. I just want to mention that there's shady stuff going on. There's connections behind the people in power on both sides of that conflict. But the Nazis were not good dudes. They were not. But I just want to say that I just want to make mention of that as we get into this complicated history, because the Americans, and they were really working closely with the Vatican here. And we need to understand that a lot of the guys who were the prime leaders in the OSS that also later became the CIA, William Wild Bill Donovan was his name, and he was a Knight of Malta who received an Order of Saint Sylvester. And then also Alan Dulles, who later became the head of the CIA, Knight of Malta, and James Jesus Anglican Knight of Malta. They all were very closely connected to the Vatican because of their Roman Catholic roots. And being Knights of Malta, the same idea, that they were not nominal Catholics, that they were true servants of the church. And that these connections that in the American government, and these guys they had connections to the Vatican. They wanted to use these German guys to fight the communists. And the Pope at this time was Pope Pius XII, who was deeply anti-communist. And he had actually, before he had become Pope, when he was still Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, he had actually been the one who had been instrumental in orchestrating a concordat with the Nazi Party in Germany, because the Vatican wanted to have a bulwark against communism. They were very threatened by Bolshevism. And after Pope Pius XII died in 1958, was it 58 or was it 53 or 58? Oh, I think it was 58. But anyway, Pope Pius XII, after he died, and he was succeeded first by Pope John the 23rd, and then after Pope John the 23rd comes Pope Paul VI, the Vatican drastically changed directions. And this is when we get Vatican II, a lot more openness in regards to the communist East. There was more of a leftward drift in Roman Catholicism. There's a lot of history regarding all of that. But before that happened, the Vatican and the American government were both instrumental in smuggling Nazis that they saw as important out of Europe because they had their own personal interests in them. And that's the complicated history that I'm trying to illustrate as we move forward into our history regarding N.A.S.A. And if you look this up, these were called the Vatican rat lines. and that they would even hide prominent Nazis in churches and smuggle them out of Europe. They helped get them passports through the Red Cross, all of this. There's been books written about all of this. This is very important history for us. And some of the Nazi war criminals they helped get out went and fled to South America, but a lot of them went to the States because they didn't just want to get them out. They wanted to use them and let them continue their careers, no longer for the Nazis, but for the West. And so that's really the history. And you can look a lot of this history up. And so we've talked about how a number of these Nazis that were prominent scientists, German scientists, they were the ones who came to the States and really started the American rocket program that eventually became NASA. And we've already mentioned Wernher von Braun, but there are others that we could mention as well. There's Kurt Heinrich de Boos, and he was a V-2 rocket tester. He was a member of the SS, and he became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center. So very, very prominent. There's Arthur Rudolph, Nazi's weapon engineer who worked on the Saturn V rocket. And Eberhard Rees, and he was von Braun's deputy, and he eventually succeeded him as the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center. So these are all examples of how really the origins of the American rocket program was really the Nazi rocket program. And this is important for us. And when you understand the truth about Nazism and you understand the truth about the SS, that's going to be strike one. But we're going to move forward. And the next thing I want to say is we really get into the history of NASA. NASA was founded in 1958, but from 1945 to 1958, all throughout that time as the Americans were developing their rocket technology, that this was a military program. And as a matter of fact, it was a classified military program. And that is a significant detail for us when you know all the truth that goes on with covert military research operations. A lot of shady stuff goes on. Everything gets compartmentalized. Everything's on a need-to-know basis. When you understand how the military runs operations like that, it provides a lot of insight into what's going on with space and all this. And they started shooting these rockets up into space. You can look up this stuff, Operation Dominic, what have you. People have wondered where they tried to shoot these rockets up into the firmament. There's a lot of stuff that we could talk about regarding that era of history. But then I want to move forward even from that, and I want to keep moving forward at a good pace. The next person we need to talk about in the history of NASA is Jack Parsons, who was a big developer of rocket fuel, very intelligent man. Some people would even say a brilliant man, but was also a big occultist. And this was a guy who was inspired by Aleister Crowley. And for those who do not know who Crowley is, he was called in his day when he was alive, he was a prominent magician, sorcerer, did all sorts of just evil things, big promoter of what he called sex magic, a lot of debauched stuff. I'm not even going to get into the details of all that. But he was called by the London newspapers of his day as the wickedest man alive. And if you know all of the terrible, unspeakable, wicked things that people in the occult do, it will tell you a lot of what you need to know. And then, so with Crowley, was a big promoter of his system of sex magic and sex magic rituals, and that's prominent for us in regards to Jack Parsons, because Jack Parsons was really inspired by him, in some ways a follower of his teachings, and him and Ron L. Hubbard performed these same type of rituals that Crowley performed. And the most prominent one was called the Babylon Working Ritual, which they performed in 1946. And I think that what we need to understand about this is that these rituals, I think, opened up doorways in the spiritual world. I'll get into that more in just a sec. And then Ron L. Hubbard, who's a part of the story, so we see all these shady connections here. Ron L. Hubbard is the guy who went on to found Scientology, which is a very nasty cult, prominent in Hollywood. Many people will think of individuals like Tom Cruise is one of the big actors associated with that. There's a lot of examples we could talk to about that. I think the actress Leah Remini, I think is her name, she came out of that. John Travolta, I believe, is a part of that. So there's a lot of it has a lot of money, it has a lot of influence in Hollywood. That goes back to Ron L. Hubbard, nasty cult. Well, so Parsons and Hubbard, they were conducting these rituals in the desert. And my theory, I've talked about this in my book, Apparently the Monsters Are Real, is that I believe personally that they were that those rituals that they were conducting, very similar to the ones that Crowley was doing in his day, opened up a lot of portals that led to this explosion of the UFO phenomenon. And the Babylon working ritual they performed in 1946 is only 1 year before the famous Roswell event that the military called a weather balloon, which there's a lot of credible evidence to really show that it was not a weather balloon. L.A. Marzulli, he made some excellent documentaries about the Roswell crash. So if you want to go look up some of his stuff, he has two really good documentaries. They actually went out and examined the debris field of the Roswell crash, and they talked about how they found material there that we really weren't able to identify on the traditional what is it called, elemental chart. Really fascinating stuff. He talked about they talked to the family members of people who were associated with that and how the military really covered that up. I went down to New Mexico, and I went also to the UFO Research Center down there, did research down there. I drove out to the crash site too. When I wasn't able to do as extensive research as Marzulli was able to, he does a good job with the research he does. But I've been down there, and I've been to that part of the world. It's very, very interesting when you get into the history. And even though the UFO phenomenon is a whole rabbit hole, and I don't think it's extraterrestrials, I don't think it's connected to outer space. I've even just said previously in this video how there is a deception regarding outer space. But the UFO phenomenon is relevant regarding our history of NASA, even though we won't be able to flesh out all of the details, because the reverse engineering of these craft has led to, it's really played a big part if you get into the secret history regarding the development of stealth aircraft and even our rockets and a lot of important stuff. So there's a lot you could get into regarding all of that as well. Now we come finally to the Masonic astronauts. And this is a part of it that I want to read. Let me get into this. I haven't even read anything out of Faulkner yet, but let me just read a portion of what he wrote here. This would be, because Faulkner really tries to downplay this. So page 217, 225. So this is what, I'm going to just read a couple excerpts from Faulkner, and then I'm going to get into the history of documenting how a lot of these astronauts were in fact Freemasons. So Faulkner, first on page 217, he says this: if the Earth is a flat disk covered by a dome that contains all astronomical bodies, then the moon cannot orbit the Earth. That's true. Nor can satellites orbit the Earth. That's also true. Therefore, there are no satellites. Now, there's satellite. We could talk about satellites. I think there are there are things up there. I think it's interesting. You look up that NASA is actually one of the largest users of helium in the United States. You can look that up. And I do think they have things that are up above us, but I don't think satellites are what they're not what we've been told that they are. Let's just say that. So there's a little bit more nuance to that. That's a whole other rabbit hole. There are no astronauts. We haven't been to the moon. Then what about all those images from space, such as the International Space Center, and the photos and the videos of astronauts on the moon in the late 1960s and early 1970s? Obviously, they were all fake. NASA is a sham organization that has lied about everything it supposedly has done. Flat earthers spend considerable time and effort attempting to debunk all things from NASA and arguing from NASA. So we see here that Faulkner, he does not want to get into the deep history of NASA, the shady connections of NASA that I'm bringing out, and he really doesn't like the idea that the credibility of NASA should be questioned, and that's really what we're getting into. But listen to this. Are all astronauts Freemasons? If there are no astronauts, then what about all those people who have claimed to have gone into space? The number is in the hundreds. 12 men have said that they even walked on the moon, and another 12 claim to have orbited the Earth. Are all these people lying? According to flat earthers, yes. Why would all these astronauts lie about such a thing? The stock answer is that all astronauts are Freemasons. I don't know, I don't know if I've ever met a flat earther that's been dogmatic to say every single one is. I think we would say many of them are. But let me make this comment real quick before I continue. The point is that there is an exorbitant amount of occult influence when you study the history of NASA. But even if someone's not a member of that specific group or secret society, like I said, when you understand how NASA operates, everything it comes from that roots of being a covert military organization, and then it became a civilian agency. Everything's compartmentalized, everything's on a need to know basis, and to move up in that world, you're going to be brought into the know of the deception. Yeah, they're going to promote as a general policy people who agree with their views and their beliefs and their ideologies, and it is very occultic at the top. So, but yeah, I mean, Faulkner's trying to debunk that, but his arguments are not compelling. It's a lot of straw man once again. So let me back up here. Are all these people lying? According to flat earthers, yes. Why would all these astronauts lie about such a thing? The stock answer is that all astronauts are Freemason. Since flat earthers believe that Freemasonry is at the center of the vast conspiracy to convince people that the Earth is a sphere, this explanation makes sense to them. But have all astronauts been Freemasons? Flat earthers typically reply with evidence that some astronauts have been Freemasons. So he kind of contradicts. First, he says that flat earthers believe it, all believe it, and then he says that they believe it some. It's not the way he writes this is frustrating. Flat earthers typically reply with evidence that some astronauts have been Freemasons. For instance, at least one official photograph of the Apollo 11 crew shows a Masonic ring on Buzz Aldrin's ring finger on his left hand. And Freemason publications have proudly proclaimed that the second man on the moon was one of their members. There are other examples of astronauts who indeed have been Freemasons. This is indisputable. So at least he concedes it. But does this prove that all astronauts have been Freemasons? After all, the claim by flat earthers is that all astronauts have been Freemasons. That's not necessarily true. And if being a Freemason is a prerequisite to becoming an astronaut, demonstrating that some astronauts have been Freemasons does not prove that all astronauts have been Freemasons. So you see here, he's doing the same type of bait and switch writing that we've seen all throughout. He's missing the point, and he's intentionally missing the point. It's the point is what we said before. You have this organization, you have this place that when you get into the history, it has an exorbitant amount of occult and Masonic influence. And there's so much more we could get into on all of this. And he's trying to say, well, he's basically accusing us of reading between the lines too much. You're looking at it too closely, blah, blah, blah. But that's not really what's going on. But really to document what I'm going to say, I'm going to read a few of these names of people who have been confirmed Freemasons. And this is coming from a Masonic publication, the Scottish Rite Journal. And I'm going to include the link to this so you can read this exact article called Among the Stars. And it's interesting, when you get into Freemasonry in the 20th century, they used to be a lot more encouraged to promote prominent people in society as their members because they wanted people to join. They wanted people to be a part of it. So they would often famously say, like, all these famous people, all these kings of Europe, all these presidents, all these prominent people, these prominent scientists or philosophers or free thinkers or people in Hollywood, Voltaire, John Wayne, George Washington, they would promote this. And the same was true for these astronauts. They would say, oh, see, these Freemasons include all these great people from history and from our current day. But the culture has changed a lot because now there's a lot more people who are into the truther community. There's a lot of people who are looking into these things. And now, at least in my mind, it seems that they have a lot more influence, a lot more, not influence, a lot more desire to downplay these things and try to downplay these connections because they know that people are starting to wake up to these things. So this has changed a lot. But if you go back into the history of documenting a lot of this stuff, you go into their own literature, which is really the best place to go, you can find where stuff you can read from the 50s or the 60s or the 70s where they would actually be very proud to say these people are a part of our group because they saw it as good publicity for them. But now it's really changed. The culture's changed a lot. Now that being said, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin are both confirmed to be Masons. Those would be the two most prominent ones from the famous Apollo 11 mission with the moon landing. And Colonel Leroy, quote, nicknamed Gordon Cooper, who is claimed to have been on the command pilot for Gemini 5, confirmed Mason. Don F. Eisel, Apollo 7 tour. James Benson Irwin, claimed to be the 8th person on the moon, connected to Apollo 15. Edgar Dean Mitchell, connected to Apollo 14. And those are the big ones. And the article that I'm going to share, you can read that. That's documented. That's confirmed. That's not conspiracy theory. It's confirmed history. You just can't get away from that. Getting into the Apollo 11 mission itself. So that would be, we're up to 1969 now. My friend and my brother in Christ, George Hobbs, did a really good audio getting into the connections with this with Kubrick. He went into a lot of detail with that. I'm going to include the link to that too. So I'm including the links to three things: the curvature video I mentioned, the Masonic Journal article, and then George Hobbs's article that he did where he got into the connections between Stanley Kubrick and the Apollo 11 mission, because he did a really good job of that. One thing I'll say on this, we could get into, there is a lot of credible evidence when you look at the videos, or especially a lot of the pictures connected to Apollo 11, and you look at the way the shadows argument is pretty convincing for me when you think about how light would be operating up there, and you can look at it. It really does. The shadows really does look like there's a set with lights around it. That's a good one. The lack of stars in the pictures or stuff like that could be talked about. Um, there's a lot of things along those lines that people have really poked holes into that. I know a lot of people don't even want to get into all that at all. But you can do more research on that in its own right. I would recommend listening. George Hobbs did a good audio on this. And Kubrick is another rabbit hole that's very fascinating, because Kubrick clearly was in the know on a lot of stuff. His movie, The Shining, there's a lot of connections between stuff that he embedded into that movie and the Apollo 11 stuff. So you can get into all of that. Really, if you want to talk about conspiracy theories related to Kubrick, it's pretty clear that he knew what the elites were doing. He knew what was going on, and really his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, which as a Christian I would not recommend watching it. There's a lot of debauched stuff in it, and he did that on purpose. Kubrick was not a Christian, so I'm not recommending you watch it. But he really tried to expose the occult and sexual rituals of the elites, and this was the last video he made right before they died. In the studios, they took, I think it was 18 minutes out of it, but they took some important footage out of the film. They really killed the film in many ways, really killed the promoting of the film. It was clear they did not want people to really pick up on that film. And through whatever means, he died not long after that. Some people have suspected foul play, but the Kubrick angle, Kubrick really knew what was going on with a lot of this stuff, and I think that he probably met a dark end, probably. But that is a part of this history that is really important for us to understand. And there's so many other things we could talk about. We could talk about how Nixon supposedly was able to get from, called the White House, and the landline connection went to mission control at NASA, and then they were able to connect him up to the astronauts on the moon and was able to actually talk with them. And that one's always been an eye roll for me, because you think about all of the trouble, people who have just the trouble we have with our cell phones, the trouble we even with landlines, long distance calls, and you're just thinking, with all the trouble we have with that, that one's always been even a little bit laughable to me. You can look that up, and it really is the stuff you can get into. Looking at, there's videos of people, these guys supposedly being suspended in low gravity in the upper atmosphere, and there's people who have pulled, you can see the wires, people have pulled on them. You can watch videos like that. The inconsistency with the pictures of the Earth from space, how there never really seems to be great pictures of the Earth from space, and there'll be disparities between the continents and all this. It's an endless rabbit hole. It really is. And I've never spent a ton of time on my channel even though I've tried to cover the empirical stuff on the side of cosmology enough to cover it. It's never been my main emphasis, not because it doesn't interest me at all, but for me the big picture is, how does this connect to what the Bible says? And obviously I've always had a passion for history, so a lot of that comes out too. But I've never gotten so hung up on just covering the empirical side of this ad nauseum. There are great channels that really have done a great job to cover this. David Weiss's material, even though he's not a Christian, as I'm aware, he's probably one of the more prominent flat earthers, and he's done a lot of great videos going back and forth on all this stuff. But I digress. There's so much more that could be said, but as we're already at 50 minutes, I think the point is that I hope that when you get into all this history, connections to the SS, connections to Freemasonry, Jack Parsons, all of these stuff, and then you get into, there's more we could talk about, how all of these moon missions are always named after pagan and Greek goddesses. There's all gods and goddesses. We could get into all that. Apollo, Gemini, all of this stuff. The Saturn V rocket. It's endless. It really is endless. But there's so much more we could bring out if we wanted to. But I think at this point you really start to see that the analogy I used is best. If you were frequenting a place of business or a restaurant, even if you haven't necessarily had a bad experience before you realize it, if you're a Christian, if you're being honest, this is just real. This is real life. If you realize that everybody who's in that place is some type of occultist or a Satanist or something like that, you're going to have a weird feeling in your gut, and rightly so. Your spidey sense is going to be tingling. And if we learn that about NASA, are we not allowed to ask questions? No, of course we're allowed to ask questions. And should that give us discernment to look a little closer into all this stuff? Yes, absolutely. Now, that being said, does that in of itself prove the Earth is flat or space is fake? No, you got to go to all the other stuff that we've talked about. And that's why we've talked about the biblical arguments. We've talked about how it's been proven that the Earth doesn't move. We could talk about the lack of curvature more. We could get into all of this stuff more. But really saying that this modern history related to NASA is relevant. And the more you dig into all this, you realize there's a lot of shady stuff going on. So all that being said, this is really where I want to leave things today. I hope that I've made a case to say there are good questions that we should be asking about NASA. These are fair questions. They're not unfair questions. It's not paranoia. It's not conspiracy theory. People call it that, but it's not unfair to ask questions. And this history should inform the way we think about what is being told to us about space. So there's a lot more I could say on that, but that's where I'm going to leave it today. Those who are following my channel, there is going to be an announcement video regarding some changes in the direction I'm going to go ministry-wise. Lord willing, that will be next week. And then my plan is there's going to be a new teaching series that I'm going to be jumping into. But I'm going to save all of those announcements for next week, so you can stay tuned for all of that. All of that being said, I am Joe Harper, and this is Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless everybody. If you have been blessed by the ministry of RTM, then please consider supporting our ministry and check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.